argue for a new one. What's the old long view? The old long view of Utah history is, historians, they use a big word, assimilation. What they mean is Utah used to be different from America. Utah became much the same as America. That's the old long view. The new long view that I'm going to argue for is Utah was different, became the same, and then became different again. It became different in the 1970s, the second time. Utah began differently. In fact, it was not just different, it was weird. Utahns were polygamous. The church ran the government. Brigham Young ran the economy for communal purposes rather than individual purposes. Federal government, they were so different, the federal government threw them in jail, denied all Utah women the vote, took it away from them because they voted for Mormons, and it seized church property, made the church conform. Finally they did. They granted statehood. Even after statehood, the assimilation process continued. But it didn't continue because of the federal government's stick. It continued because of the carrot of the American economy. National ways, American ways, were the best way to earn money. So Utahns adopted American ways. National corporations came in, took over much of the economy. We produced goods for national consumption. We were integrated into the economy, and we became assimilated. In 1970, Richard Pohl, very distinguished Utah historian, said, "State and nation are so interlocked that it might be asked what meaningful difference remains." Utah was, you couldn't tell the difference between Utah and America, said Richard Pohl. Distinguished historian S. George Ellsworth said the same thing. Little uniqueness to Utah's history after 1920, he said. We became similar. But then, in the mid-1970s, we changed and we became different again. The new differences weren't so large or fight-provoking by any means as the old differences. But I think even Dr. Pohl would, if he were alive, would say that they are meaningful differences. Two particular areas where the differences occurred: politics and demographics. And they're connected, as I'll explain. Politics. Utah was like America. We were ordinary. That's even hard to get your mind around. But consider this fact. 1896 statehood, 1972, there were 20 presidential elections. Utah voted for the winner in 17 of them. Only 3 states voted for more winners in those 20 elections. Usually, the party that governed Utah, or the party that governed Washington, governed Utah too. We were a mainstream, go along with the crowd, ordinary political state for 80 years. Then we changed. 1976, instead of voting for the winner, as we often did, we voted most strongly of any state for the loser, Republican Gerald Ford. In all those 80 years, Utah had never been the state that voted most strongly for any presidential candidate. We'd always been somewhere in the crowd. After 1976, we voted Republican no matter what, and we were the most Republican state in 7 of the 11 elections since then. We changed. Demographics. The second way we changed was in demographics. That change began before the 70s, but it continued into the 70s. After World War II, America had a baby boom. Utah joined the baby boom. In fact, Utah had a baby boom. After the American baby boom stopped, Utah's baby boom kept going. They said we were like an undeveloped country. In the 70s, our birth rate was between Nepal and Djibouti. That's where it was. Here's a joke from the 1980s, a Utah joke. What do you call a man in Orem who has 5 children? Impotent. Our birth rate has gone down. It's still the highest birth rate in the nation, but and we still have more children. We're different otherwise demographically. We are more married. We're the most married state too. Now, both of these differences are due to Latter-day Saints. Americans, 48% of adults are married. Back in 1960, it was 72%, way down. Utahns, 60% are married, more than in any other state. Latter-day Saints, 66% are married. So you can see the Utah difference is due to the Latter-day Saint difference. 66% of Latter-day Saints are married, more than any other American group. Children, same thing. America is here, Utah's here, Latter-day Saints are here. Though Utah Hispanics help. They have a lot of kids too. But in both cases, it's because Utah has a lot of Latter-day Saints that they change. Latter-day Saints is why Utahns are Republican. In the 11 presidential elections since 1976, Latter-day Saints voted on average 73% Republican. By some tests, nationally they're 70% Republican, and in some polls the most of any group. If back in the territory they tried to take the vote away from Mormons, they took it away from Utahns. They tried to throw out Latter-day Saints too. If they'd succeeded and only non-Mormon votes counted, Bill Clinton would have in '96. He lost terribly in Utah. He would have won Utah. It would have been his strongest state. Al Gore, 2000, his strongest state. Hillary Clinton, her 5th strongest state, if only non-Mormons got to vote in Utah. Utah has the most religiously polarized electorate of any state in America. So, what do we have? We have differences. We changed in the 1970s, and we've got political differences, demographic differences, and both of them are due to Latter-day Saints. What happened? Latter-day Saints resist socially changes that happened in America, social changes that happened in America. You heard how they resisted the Equal Rights Amendment. That's a good example. But they resist fundamentally, starting in about 1960, America changed. It was the sexual revolution. Some of you, I don't know whether anybody here remembers. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Yeah, okay. Made changes. The biggest thing you see that the changes that changed is families. And the best way to see that is this statistic. 42% of American babies are born out of marriage. After the sexual revolution, Americans married less, more sex out of marriage, more cohabiting, fewer children, more children out of marriage. Latter-day Saints resisted. Some of you will remember the family, a proclamation to the world. They preached families, they lived families, they vote families, Latter-day Saints. Now I'm going to very quickly go over 5 other trends that happened in this period that make it different from the rest of Utah history. That seems to me that sets it off. Okay, politics focused on public morality. Utahns have argued over this forever. The Equal Rights Amendment, an excellent example. Liquor's a huge example. Polygamy they started with. Cigarettes, lotteries. They prohibited cigarettes at one time. Lotteries, Sunday closing, school prayer, graduation prayer. Utahns always fight over public morality, and though both sides deny it, it's always Latter-day Saints against non-Mormons. It changed in the mid 70s. Instead of fighting over things like horse racing and liquor, we fought over things like abortion, pornography, censoring cable TV, the Equal Rights Amendment, same-sex marriage, sex and family issues. And in many of them, Utahns argued and fought, made a decision, and then federal court said, no, that isn't the decision. That's wrong. The decision goes the other way. In addition, besides that, Utah was a defense state. Lots of defense projects, and we saw them. In this period, defense became controversial. We fought over nerve gas at Tooele. We fought over biological weapons at Dugway. When we fought over these things, and we had a whole bunch of them, the people who were against them always pointed to the downwinder's tale, how nuclear testing in Nevada caused cancer in southern Utah. That was a big political theme of this time. We fought over education and taxes. Low taxes won. For most of this period, starting in the mid-'80s, Utah has had the lowest spending per student for operations of any state, 30 odd years straight of low spending. We argued over federal land. 2/3 of Utah is federal land. The federal government took stronger control of its land, and power shifted from Utahns who lived near the land to national environmental organizations who had lawyers in court and lobbyists in Washington. And federal land changed, and it was hard on parts of rural Utah. I'm gonna sum up here. I want to say one more thing that happened. It was a time of social disorder. From 1960 to 1993, this wasn't particular to Utah, violent crime in America rose sixfold. Rose even faster in Utah. We were 1/3 the national average when it started. We ended up just a little over half the national average over the time. So we went up a little faster, but we stayed below. Drug use went up sixfold from 1978 to 2015. Homelessness. We didn't have a homelessness problem before 1980. It's nearly, at least not one that we talked about. Child abuse went way up. For the most part, Utah had less social trouble than America, but social trouble still went up, and it affected Utah and Utah politics in this period. Some people, I can't tell you this is true. Some people say it was related to changes in families, changes to sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and general disorder of that sort. I don't know whether that's true. Sum up. Utah changed. The long view of Utah changed in the 70s. The long view of Utah has changed, so that now we're different again. We're different from America, in not so different as we were, but different, and that seems to be first, that explains some of our politics, and second, kind of makes us a more interesting place, and history a little more interesting. Thanks a lot.
Hi, my name's Molly. I am from the Hinckley Institute of Politics. I'm excited to be here, but I want to throw in the caveats that one, I am neither historian nor do we do a lot of research at the Hinckley. We are more focused on promoting civic engagement among youth. We see that when people vote in their first election when they turn 18, that's the strongest indicator as to how they are going to be in our participatory democracy. So we focus largely on youth civic engagement, on encouraging youth civic engagement, but obviously there is some good history involved in that as well. To start, I want to go over some background as to who our youth today are, how they differ from previous generations. We're going to look at voter turnout, youth mobilization, barriers to youth participation, as well as looking forward to see what issues might be impacting our youth looking ahead. So to start with, on the whole, our younger voters tend to be far more racially diverse than older generations, both nationally and within Utah. When we look at our minority share by age group from the 2010 census, we see massive diversity when we look at those under 5 compared at the other side of this graph when we look at those over 85. Overall, when we look at this, we have Westside Salt Lake at the top. In the dark gray, we have Salt Lake City. In the lighter brown, that trends most closely out of any place in Utah with the U.S., followed by Salt Lake County and Utah. We also see this changing quite dramatically. So Utah tends to track about 50 years behind the nation when we look at our diversity. So as you see,
50 years.
50 years. So if we look up here, so we have U.S. projection in 2060, right, of what that will be. Then we have Utah 2060 and U.S. right now, and then Utah 2010. So we're still pretty white. We also see this when we look at these projections in a little bit more detail. So this is U.S. youth overall. We see that overall our young adults are about 55% white. In 2060, we're expecting that to be about 36%. And then when we look in Utah, again, predominantly white at 74% in 2017, but we expect that to drop to 57% based on U.S. Census data in 2060. Younger voters tend to be more progressive. I would maybe Mr. Decker and I can talk about this. I think our young folks who are getting involved actually tend to track far more closely with their national peers than some other Utah trends, but still, I would say, hold that Republican lean. When we look at medical marijuana, younger voters are less likely to be opposed to that, more likely to support it. But you also see, again, the strong Republican lean in, where they are still more likely to support Mitt Romney than Jenny Wilson in the 2018 election. Additionally, they are more likely to identify as independent and remove themselves from partisan politics. However, they still are quite partisan. So they find themselves disenchanted with the party system, although they still do hold quite strong ideological identities. When we look at voter turnout overall, I think we tend to see young voters as apathetic as we look forward, but if you actually look at this, young voters, regardless of generation, do not turn out to vote. So when we look at this, it tends to be when we're younger, we don't vote, and then as we get older, our turnout increases bit by bit. One thing that was pretty exciting, though, is that millennial turnout nearly doubled in a midterm election from 2014 to 2018, which you don't see often. And actually, if you were to pool Gen Z, Millennial, and Gen X, they outvoted boomers and prior generations, which is the first time that's happened in our history, that the younger voters have outvoted older voters. When we look at mobilization, we see that younger voters or young folks are more likely to come out for two big reasons. One is when they are the target of a policy. So when a policy either exclusively or primarily impacts them, they're likely to get involved. The other, and I had a hard time coming up with the term for this, is when they're more radical. So whether they're more passionate about it or hold a more extreme opinion than the others that are involved. Regardless of what gets them involved, young people tend to resort to barnstorming tactics when they're getting involved. Things like protests, marches, tactics like that, as opposed to more bridge-building policy and engagement measures. This is largely because young people traditionally don't have access to the levers of power that get to make those decisions. So obviously, looking at targets, the Vietnam War and draft is the best example of this. While the Vietnam War, the impacts were mostly felt, the lottery draft explicitly targeted young voters, specifically men. It's also a great example of looking at that organizing. This is a picture from the 60s of a protest at the Park Building at the University of Utah. But we see college campuses having protests prior to 65. In 65, when the war escalates, so do the protests. 67 has the March on the Lincoln Memorial. 69, the implementation of the draft lottery. We have Kent State, and then eventually the Nixon administration likes Vietnam. We also see the 26th Amendment, which extended voting rights to 18-year-olds. They also tend to be more likely to get involved when they are the radical on an opinion. In Utah, I think we see this again when their opinions are counter to those in power. So as Mr. Decker identified, we have Republican or a conservative government, both in the executive and legislature. So I think we're more likely to see them get involved. In Utah over the years, we've seen them organizing around police brutality, LGBT inclusion, and immigration. I also put asterisks by gun violence and climate change, because I think you could also make a pretty compelling argument that our young people are targets of the policies surrounding those. While gun violence is quite prevalent, school shootings explicitly target young folks. And then climate change, those impacts will be felt more dramatically by our younger generations than anyone else. When we look at their barriers to participation, I think oftentimes young people do not believe that they have the necessary expertise to get involved. Yeah, so this is the immigration rally in 2006 in Salt Lake City. Pretty cool turnout. So they feel like they don't either understand enough about government or about the issue to get involved. And then oftentimes they are excluded from decision-making processes, even when they apply to them, and can be kind of invisible in our political narrative. So we need to encourage them to participate. Looking ahead, I think that there are a couple social movements that will be interesting to watch that are largely driven by the youth moving forward. March for Our Lives, obviously gun violence in schools, is going to be quite prevalent. They are transitioning more from that barnstorming approach to more bridge building, looking at red flag laws, mental health in schools, other measures similar to that. Obviously, as we learned 2 weeks ago, climate change, as those protests were taking place both in Salt Lake City and around the world. Looking at the organizing surrounding that. I think one that will be interesting, depending on how we handle it, is looking at student loan debt, which would also be interesting since it is an economic issue rather than explicit. Well, it has obviously social ties, but it is not explicitly a social issue. It has pretty deep economic implications. That said, though, Utah also has the least student debt in the country, so while that may be a big impetus for youth organizing nationally, it may not be as big in Salt Lake. And then democratic socialism, which is the topic du jour, I feel, right now when we talk about young folks. One, it's a little small to see right now. This is probably one of my favorite headlines I've seen lately, was that there is an annual conference of Ayn Rand objectivists, and they're worried about the health of the conference because no one wants to be an objectivist anymore. All the young people want to be socialists. So I got a kick out of that one. And I think this is a big one too as we look at different generational understandings of what socialism is and democratic socialism. Millennials and Gen Z were not alive during the Cold War. They did not experience the red lines. They did not see the totalitarian regimes that were associated with it. And instead, I think they see many of what they would perceive the failings of free trade capitalism. They see they're the first generation that's not predicted to be better off than their predecessors. They have seen massive, staggering income inequality. They see the most prosperous nation that's ever existed in history that can't provide some basic services to its own citizens. And so I think that this is going to be a very interesting topic moving forward, looking at this as the pretty staggering generational divides as well as to how we see this. And yeah, I wanted to keep it under time. So that's all I have for you. Thank you.
It's great to be with all of you today. Am I too close here? Dina mentioned that I still write a column with Frank Pignanelli in the Deseret News, and over my career I've literally written thousands of columns and editorials, and you probably heard the definition of an editorial writer or a columnist. These are the people that come down out of the hills after the battle is over and shoot the wounded. And if you think about that, there's a lot of truth to that. I've done a lot of that in my career. So Dina asked me to talk about the role and impact of media in Utah politics. And it's in order to do that, we really have to talk about the impact of technology and the new technologies and social media and so forth, and how they have impacted media, because that has also played a big role in the coverage of politics. And these factors have changed the way media covers politics and the role of media in politics in two ways. One is the news media in general have been hurt badly by the new technologies and social media and the internet and blogging and all of those things. So they don't have as many resources to devote to coverage of politics. And then second, the new technology has provided politicians channels to communicate directly with citizens, with voters, so they don't have to necessarily go through the news media. So both of those things have impacted the news media and coverage of politics really quite dramatically. When I left, I worked for Governor Levitt for about 7 years. I had previously been managing editor at the Deseret News, and then the Deseret News recruited me to come back as managing editor, and I was there for another couple of years. So I went back to the Deseret News in 1998, and when I worked for the governor, I had worked really hard in the technology arena trying to bring state government up to speed on the internet and encourage state agencies to develop websites and use email and all of those things. This was in the early days of those things. So when I went back to the Deseret News, I very much wanted to bring the newspaper into the internet age and take advantage of the new technology. So we created a newspaper website, put our content in it. We started to break down some of the old newspaper habits, for example, of publishing news once a day. I mean, back in those days, we published news once a day. And it was, of course, compiled in the paper and delivered to subscribers. So we understood that the internet would become a really important way to deliver our content. We felt like we had the high and mighty calling, essential for society, of covering the news and delivering it to paying subscribers. That was our business, and we thought we were good at it, and no one else would be as good at that as we were. And I think this kind of attitude extended to the most people in the news media. Obviously, advertising was critically important, especially classified advertising to support our business. But we arrogantly thought of that kind of advertising as sort of a necessary evil. We essentially at that time had a monopoly in delivering news creation and delivery. Advertisers had to come to us. News operations were enormously profitable at that time. We were seeing 15 and 20% returns on investment year after year. So we saw the internet coming, but we didn't understand quickly enough or take advantage of its full capabilities. We didn't take advantage of its interactivity, the social effects of the internet and social media. We didn't take advantage of user-created content or the reality that anyone could become a publisher. And so our view of our mission and our business was far too narrow. So we saw smart young internet entrepreneurs seeing opportunities that we had failed to grasp. The early competitors like AOL and Yahoo and online classified advertising sites like Craigslist were far easier to use than our services were. In our arrogance, we thought that people needed something interesting like news to get them to look at advertising. And of course, Craigslist and locally KSL.com very effectively decoupled classified advertising from news, something that we had never dreamed of. And this completely destroyed classified advertising for newspapers. And that was an enormous blow because classified advertising was absolutely critical to the success of newspapers, to our revenues. We didn't think of newspapers as broad information providers, providing all kinds of information. We just were focused on news. We thought we had to internally produce all of the information, kind of like I remember the days when Novell, in its heyday, thought that it could completely control networking. In fact, I remember conversations with the CEO of Novell. They said, we're gonna own this whole area of networking. Everybody's gonna have to come onto our network. So Google came along as the ultimate information provider, initially not creating much content itself, but linking to all sources of information and making it very easy to search for that information. So in some ways, they were in the same business we were. So why didn't the newspaper evolve? Why didn't the newspaper start Google? Newspapers were the original information sources. Why didn't we view our mission as broader and provide paths to all information? So we missed a whole lot of that. Social media sites like Facebook and others saw the value of millions, even billions of people creating their own information and content and interactively sharing it with others, of course, on the Facebook platform. Why didn't the newspaper become Facebook? It wouldn't have really been that big of a stretch, but we were too arrogant in the way we viewed our business. We thought that everyone had to come to us to buy advertising instead of creating an interactive marketplace where anyone could create their own advertising, make it easily searchable with easy e-commerce capabilities and sophisticated delivery of goods. Why did the newspaper become Amazon or eBay? We were the original advertising sites, advertising opportunities. So we were big publishers. We didn't understand that with the new technology, everyone could become a publisher. Everyone could start a newspaper, publish a blog, create a news website, and reach almost anyone anywhere in the world. So the news media was disrupted, and of course that changed the way we cover politics. Many newspapers are gone. The entire industry is struggling, except for a few specialty newspapers, I would call them, like the New York Times and Washington Post and Wall Street Journal. They are still successful, but in some ways they're almost niche publications. And the regional and city local newspapers have many have gone out of business. When I was at the Deseret News, we had a full-time reporter covering the city, full-time reporter covering the county, another covering other local governments. We had full-time people at the Capitol, and that was in addition to the political editor and lots of other reporters. So today, in Utah, Salt Lake City is really lucky to have two reasonably successful daily newspapers. I don't know if there's another market in the country our size that has two newspapers. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, about the two newspapers. But so in many ways, we're really lucky to have two newspapers. Today, politicians can talk back more easily. The news media no longer act as gatekeepers to all information, all political information. They can no longer filter what the politicians are saying or what they're pushing out there. Donald Trump, of course, is the main big example of creating his own following. He has 65 million followers on Twitter, 87 million followers on all social media, although that's probably fairly dramatically inflated. It includes people that have just liked his accounts and things like that. And there's lots and lots of specialty online publications like my publication, UtahPolicy.com, and many others. So having said all of that, traditional media, traditional newspaper are still really important. Less so, but still important. despite being able to communicate directly to voters, most politicians still want their stories published in the newspapers and to get on TV. And a large percentage of the social media posts link back to traditional media stories, traditional newspaper stories, and so forth. So the traditional media still have a large impact, but not as large as they once had. And then there is another big trend, and I would call it the Trump effect, is this divisiveness that we see in the country, this division between liberals and conservatives and so forth, has also extends to the news media. And so if you, particularly the national news media, if you watch, and I look at all these things because I'm love punishment or something, but I will switch back and forth from Fox News to CNN and MSNBC and so forth, and it's like you're on different planets. I mean, literally. If you watch Fox News for a while, then switch it over to CNN. They are so dramatically different in their political perspectives, and so we are seeing this divisiveness or division in the news media, like we're seeing in politics in general. That the Trump has changed the way, has changed, again, this is the national news media, the national level, but he has really changed the relationship between reporters and those that they cover, the presidency, perhaps it extends down into Congress as well. I mean, most of the national reporters that cover the White House hate Trump, I mean, except for, again, the conservative. And you can understand why, because he disparages them, he calls them fake news, he becomes very personal. I mean, it's very difficult to cover someone objectively when he hates you and you don't like him. And I really do think that many in the national media have become this way. I mean, I read the Washington Post, and I'm certain that there are a dozen Washington Post reporters who get up every morning and say, "What nasty thing can I write about Trump today?" And it obviously happens on the other side as well. So it's really open warfare. I mean, in my lifetime, I have never seen this kind of hatred, this open warfare between a president or a subject being covered and the news media. I mean, the news media, the more liberal news media in Washington, gave George W. Bush a really hard time. They didn't like him. His media coverage was almost all negative, but he just sat back and took it. He didn't fight back. Well, Trump fights back. I mean, one of the most entertaining things to ever do is watch Trump hold a press conference and just take any questions from anyone, and he'll go on for 45 minutes. And he holds his own, and he changes the subject, and he calls them fake news, and he obfuscates and goes on the attack. It's really interesting to watch, and I have never witnessed things like that over my experience in this business. So going back 150 years, we did have the partisan press. And we're almost back to that today, to that sort of tribalism. So locally, we're seeing the Salt Lake Tribune really struggle. As you know, it is trying to move because advertising will no longer support the newspaper. They're just not going to make it if they have to rely on advertising. Print advertising has dried up, and online advertising, while growing, isn't enough to sustain the newspaper and sustain a large group of reporters. And so they're going to a nonprofit model and hoping that the community, that wealthy people in the community and corporations and foundations will support them enough that they can continue going. So they've really been a victim of all of these things we've been talking about. The Deseret News, by contrast, is still doing quite well, mostly because, two factors. It's part of the family of news and information operations, including KSL TV, KSL Radio, KSL.com, Deseret Book. And together, they're doing a pretty good job of figuring out how do you survive in this new environment. The second reason that Deseret News can continue and I think be successful is that they have a worldwide audience. The Tribune's audience is Salt Lake City. The Deseret News obviously covers Salt Lake City and Utah, but they have a worldwide audience of LDS members, and they're doing a lot of things to reach out to them, and not just to LDS people, but people who have similar values, people who are concerned about family. So you're seeing a lot of coverage in the Deseret News, a lot of in-depth stories on these kind of topics, and so they're trying to reach out beyond just the Utah audience, and to some extent are having good success at that. So obviously there have been dramatic changes in the industry, a lot of it driven by technology, a lot of it driven by politics at the national level. I do think the news media will continue to be very important in political coverage. In many ways, the news media will still set the agenda, but they will not be as influential as they have been in the past. Thank you.
So I'm going to ask our panelists if they'll sit up at the table so that we can they can respond to any questions you might have in the audience. So, are there any questions for the panelists? Yeah, we'll wait till you guys get a seat. So the woman here in front has a question for you, and we all get settled.
I have a question for Lori. So the 4 women that were the founders of Mormon Women for the ERA, and I might not have that correct. So Sonia Johnson was excommunicated. What was the fate of the other 3 women?
Did everybody hear the question?
No.
So, just asking that Sonia Johnson was excommunicated from the LDS Church as a result of her activity. The question was, what was the fate of the other 3 women?
That were the founders.
That were the founders.
That's a really good question. To be honest with you, I have not done intense research on what those other 3 founders did. I know they were all in turmoil in the church. So whether I assumed all 4 were no longer in the church, but I need to look into that. The majority of my research was on the conservative. I can give you details on the conservative ladies, but I did want to touch on them at the end just to show the other side. So I did more research on the conservative, and I can tell you about them if you're curious where they ended up. But I am not sure 100% if they. I don't believe they are still active in the church, but don't quote me on that. So I think most of them had a real trial.
Okay, so we're going to try something with the mics here. I think we're going to leave this little lapel mic for you guys to pick up, and we'll utilize the handheld for questions.
I'd like to direct this maybe to LaVarr and maybe even Rod, because you're both involved in the media in some aspect, but particularly in the print media. And I'm looking at October 5th in just a couple of weeks. It's going to be a big day. We're going to have the opening of General Conference, and Sam Young is organizing a national march, Protect Our Children, at the same time. And I would like to challenge LaVarr, and I'd like to see the headlines on the next day, on October 6th, when Russell Nelson might give something very extraordinary as to who grabs the headlines versus the Deseret News over the Salt Lake Tribune over Sam Young's march. And I'll bet you anything that the Tribune will probably grab Sam Young, and the Deseret News will probably go over with Russell Nelson. Just my challenge. I'll put you to lunch on that.
That's probably correct. I would not expect the President Nelson to refer to Sam. I'm not even
No,
sure
he won't
exactly what you're
refer to it.
referring to. However, he does have the. He has created a lot of headlines himself recently as well. But you're probably right.
I'd like to address this to the first question with regard to women that were, I guess, penalized for their activism in the ERA. A couple of years ago, I spoke at a funeral, my aunt's funeral, and I spoke only because I was a safe person. She was director and president of the ERA in Utah County. And for her effort, she was excommunicated. It cost her marriage, but also at her funeral, half of her children didn't show up for her own funeral. And what I want to suggest is the pain that her activism caused her and the way that the church came down on her affected her for the rest of her life. She never really recovered from that. I don't know about Sonia, but I knew Sonia's family pretty well in Logan, Utah, and when I asked about them, they said, well, we don't talk about Sonia. So my question is, maybe a comment is, has anybody ever considered what happened to these women, and is there any hope that maybe they could ever reconcile with the church again and their political activism?
Oh, you can give it behind me.
You know, I don't feel like I can speak for them if they would want to reconcile with the church. I do know very closely other women that were excommunicated shortly thereafter that have no interest in coming back to the church. They feel like it was such a traumatic event for them. Unfortunately, it became a really, really toxic debate, and these women were treated, in my opinion, unjustly. So I absolutely feel for these women. I said to one that I know very dearly and closely was excommunicated, I said to her, you know, she claims she's a Mormon at heart, and I said to her, well, if you're a Mormon at heart, would you ever consider coming back? And she said, absolutely not until it's more equal in the church for women. So I think from what I see is that the divide is still there, and people hold to those sides. And really what I was hoping to do in this paper, there's a whole, I don't know if you all are aware of this, there's a whole movement to actually ratify the ERA again, and that Utah would be the last state needed. However, that's very complicated because 5 states rescinded their ratification, so a lot of things would have to happen for that to happen. But in saying that, there's so much that was in common, and it got left to the wayside. They had really commonalities. When I'm looking at the law arguments of the conservatives in their conference, and looking at the law arguments in the Mira, the newsletter, they're saying the same things, but they couldn't see. And so, you know, I think I've seen the Utah Women's Unite videos about the ERA, and I just feel like in order to really hit equality and the potential of an ERA, they've got to face the facts. Again, what we're seeing is that the 14th Amendment clause has worked. The conservative women's idea has worked. The progress we've made is from the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. So people say, well, that's just not vast enough. There's still all these laws on the state. Well, there are, but they're important laws. So I'm probably running out of my time. So I'll leave it at that. But there's important protection laws that are still in place. I say let's do a new amendment and add a little clause to the end that allows for protective legislation. Somehow combine these ideas, because I don't see how it can possibly move forward, and the women are entrenched, and they stay entrenched with these ideas. They don't seem to want to see the response the first time I presented this was pretty crazy. So they don't want to see that they had anything in common. So we have a work to do.
Any questions?
I strongly disagree with that comment, but I'm moving on. One thing, Mr. Decker, that you didn't discuss was gerrymandering, wedge issues, suppression of the vote, especially in places like San Juan County. I think all of those contribute. I have a family in Davis County, and the kids say, I have never, someone I voted for has never been elected. I'm basically, making the protest vote. I think all of those are factors when it comes to why we are different. Maybe we're not so different. We're just making sure that the people who want it to be different control the voting in this state.
Surely there is gerrymandering. The ERA, you could call a wedge issue. And San Juan County, I don't know whether the vote was suppressed, they had the court case. The court case was that it was gerrymandered. It is true the Native American vote has been low. Some people say that's because they're out on the reservation and it's a long way to go and they don't care. I don't know. Now, as to your point, yes, there has been Native Americans were mistreated in San Juan. Yes, there is gerrymandering in Utah. But those are, if say we've got we've got a referendum that says we'll have a committee that'll draw lines. If the committee draws lines, it'll make a difference of 1 or 2 seats, 3 seats in the legislature. Not a legislature that's 3-1 often Republican. It may be true, I'm sure it will be true, that for at least a few years we'll see more Native Americans voting in San Juan County. I doubt they can displace the Anglo control down there because there's a representative not in San Juan County but in several counties, and it'll be hard for them to elect a Democrat down there. They even get more Republican. It seems to me, at any rate, that while there are abuses and maybe they should be corrected, if you correct them, you've still got Latter-day Saints voting 70% Republican, and they are 2/3 of the Utah electorate. And that's the explanation for why Utah votes Republican, and all of these other things are fringe issues, or so it seems to me.
Other questions? We have time for one more quick question.
I thought there was a councilman that's now Navajo that's on the council down in Blanding. So I thought things were changing some down there.
The county commission.
Yeah,
the county commission, and it has been 2-1. It is now gerrymandered, so that it ends up, or it has been, so that it ends up 2 white guys and a Navajo.
But that didn't change.
That did change.
Now two
Navajos and a white guy.
That's what I thought.
And the judge drew it so that that's the way it's going to be. A 50-something% of the county's Navajo.
But the legislature isn't likely to change.
No.
The legislature isn't likely to change because that's 50-something% of San Juan County's Navajo, but of the legislative district, it's mostly Anglo.
So we're going to close with that, and thank you all so much for coming. And if we could just thank our panelists one last time.